Welcome to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. I'm John, Father John Deere, and today I'm speaking with my friend Kazu Haga, author and great teacher of Kingian nonviolence. This podcast is a project of www.beatitudecenter.org, where you can find many other podcasts and regular Zoom programs on the nonviolence of Jesus and practicing nonviolence and working for a more just, more nonviolent world. So I always like to begin with a little prayer, so I invite everyone just to take a deep breath wherever you are and just to relax and recenter yourself and enter into the presence of the God of peace, the Holy Spirit of peace, who loves you infinitely. Let's welcome the nonviolent Jesus here with us. Just take a moment to ask for whatever graces of peace and mindfulness and justice that you need. Beloved God of peace, thank you for all the blessings of life and love and peace that you give us. Be with us now as we reflect together on your call to live out and practice the vision of active, creative nonviolence, as Jesus did, as Dr. King did, as Gandhi did. Bless us, inspire us, disarm us, strengthen us, and send us out renewed to do your will, that we might help you to end poverty, war, injustice, racism, greed, growing fascism, and the whole culture of violence, that we might be your beatitude people of universal love, compassion, and peace. We ask this blessing in Jesus' name. It's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce everybody to my friend Kazu Haga. He's the founder of East Point Peace Academy, a member of the Ahimsa Collective and the Fierce Vulnerability Network, and the author of a brilliant book called Healing Resistance, A Radically Different Response to Harm, which I hope everyone will get. He's a practitioner, trainer, and teacher of nonviolence, as well as restorative justice and organizing and mindfulness, and he works with incarcerated youth and other youth activists around the country. He has over 20 years' experience teaching nonviolence and social change work, and he resides in Oakland with his new baby at Canticle Farm, which is an inner-city community of nonviolence right there, based around a garden. It's fantastic. And Kazu has a brand new book out called Fierce Vulnerability, Healing from Trauma, Emerging Through Collapse. So just hot off the presses. So welcome, Kazu. I'm delighted you could be with me today.
Me.
So you've been teaching Kingian nonviolence for years, Kazu, and we've spoken in the past, and you bring a whole new, fresh perspective, and I'm sure you're still teaching away. So I thought we could just start with the basics of Kingian nonviolence. What would you like our listeners to know these days, in 2025, as while we're going through, as the bottom line fundamentals of Kingian nonviolence?
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. One is that in some ways it's important to talk about what nonviolence is not, because there's so many misunderstandings of what nonviolence is out in the world. You know, one of the things that I always say is that one of the biggest misunderstandings that exists about nonviolence is that it's about simply not being violent. And obviously, you know, it's part of the picture, but I think there's a danger in assuming that as long as we're not practicing violence, then we are practicing nonviolence. Because nonviolence is not about what not to do as much as it's about what you're going to do when you see violence, when you see injustice in your own home, in your community, in your own heart. What are we going to do to actively transform that violence? I think it's easy to see the violence and injustice that we see in our world and kind of look the other way and say, oh, it doesn't affect me, that's none of my business, and then think I'm a nonviolent person because I'm not actively engaged in the violence. But nonviolence really requires us to ask the question, when you see violence, how am I going to intervene? What am I going to do to play a role in transforming the violence and the harm and the injustice? And, you know, I think the other thing that I would add to that is that the thing that Kingian nonviolence and other modalities, philosophies of nonviolence that are grounded in an ethical, principled approach to nonviolence, is really committed to the healing of relationships, right? Like as we stand up and say no to violence, as we stand up and resist injustice, how do we do so in a way that reminds us that ultimate goal of any conflict is the healing and the reconciliation of relationships? One of my friends and incarcerated nonviolence trainers, he's currently incarcerated in Soledad State Prison, once taught me that resolving an issue is about resolving a conflict is about fixing issues, and reconciling a conflict is about repairing relationships. And nonviolence at its best does both. It gives us a way to fix issues and pass legislation and pass new laws, change policies, but also does the work of healing and mending relationships. And I think in order to get to beloved community, in order to move towards reconciliation, we have to have an eye for both fixing issues and repairing the relationships.
That's so helpful, Kazu. Thank you so much. Well, in your book, Healing Resistance, you outline Dr. King's principles of nonviolence from this perspective of healing relationships. So tell me about some of your key points in that book.
Yeah, so one of my favorite principles, Kingian nonviolence is grounded in these 6 principles. And the second principle says that the beloved community is the framework for the future. And, I work with a lot of young people and people of different generations, and the term beloved community has become pretty popular over the last 10 years or so, which is a really beautiful thing. But I think when, any sort of framing goes mainstream, sometimes we lose some of the essence and things get lost in translation. And so, I oftentimes talk to people about, oh, well, what do you think beloved community is? Who's part of your beloved community? And they say, oh, well, my family and my activist community, my spiritual community. And I think it's important to celebrate community wherever we have it. We live in such an isolated world. And at the same time, I always want to challenge people to think a little bit deeper, because when Dr. King was talking about beloved community and the theologian Josiah Royce coined the term beloved community, they weren't talking about loving the people that are easy to love and loving the people that are already part of your close, tight-knit community. The work of building beloved community is about learning to cultivate compassion and understanding, or at the very least, curiosity, in an acknowledgement of the dignity of the people that we don't enjoy hanging out with, right? The people on the other side of the political aisle, the people who may even be causing us harm. And I think that's, one of the things about nonviolence is like people think it's all about love and peace and it's easy and beautiful and all that. But the work of purifying our own heart of hatred and resentment and cultivating that sort of universal goodwill for all life is actually a really difficult, challenging thing to do. And so I think nonviolence, when understood in the proper context, it's something that we really need to grapple with. It's not an easy thing to practice.
It's so interesting, your title of your book. You put together these 2 words which people often don't consider together: healing, and you're talking about social healing, the healing of peoples, but resistance, which is standing up and saying no to structured injustice and violence and trying to stop it and transform it. Tell us about the combination of those words, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I come from the lineage of one of the fiercest resistors this country has ever known, right? Dr. King was arrested almost 30 times throughout his life, and he was not scared to say no. He was not scared to resist and disrupt the kind of easy pattern of the status quo. And I think that's a really important part of the lineage of nonviolence that we really, particularly in these times, need to remember, that nonviolence is about this unwavering faith that we are interdependent, that my liberation depends on the liberation of all people. But also, in order to get to that place, that sometimes we need the courage to stand up and to resist injustice, to resist violence, that when people are acting out in those ways, that they are not at their best, right? So part of the work that we need to do is to try to invite them to do better. And oftentimes that has to start with doing whatever we can to stop the immediate harm first. And so I think that side of nonviolence, the lineage that has the courage to say no to injustice, is a really important part of the history of nonviolent movements.
So here we are now with the Trump administration facing growing fascism, white supremacy, authoritarianism, and really the collapse of democracy. But this has been decades, centuries in the making, and we've been heading here a long time. And we need resistance and healing resistance and nonviolent action. And, you know, I'm hearing other longtime activists say they're expecting a lot of people to rise up in the months and years ahead. I'm not sure about that, but if they do, if a lot of people start wanting to take public action, you and I know it needs to be nonviolent action. So can you tell us a little bit about any thoughts you have about active nonviolent resistance against the systemic injustice which we're seeing in a kind of a new way under the Trump administration, or any
Yeah,
responses that you would encourage people to take?
well, I love the work of my friends Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, who did research for dating back like hundreds of years, looking at social movements throughout the world. And they showed that nonviolent movements are twice as effective as violent movements. So I think it is important, even from that kind of strategic lens, to really value the importance of nonviolent discipline. But I think it's also, as someone who does a lot of work around trauma, when I look at Donald Trump, I can so easily see that he is a deeply, deeply traumatized person who's operating less out of an ideology and more out of this like brokenness in his heart. And that's something that I can have compassion for. And it's also important to know that me having compassion for Donald Trump will probably never change Donald Trump. Like, Donald Trump is never going to be aware that I sit and try to cultivate understanding and compassion and empathy for him. It's never going to change him. But it does change me, right? Like, the work that I do to try to have universal goodwill for all human beings because I believe that all life is sacred does change and reorient the way that I walk through the world. And so I think it's one of the important things to keep in mind about building nonviolent movements is, yes, we need to move in a way that acknowledges the dignity of all people and has compassion for all people. But sometimes that work, that specific piece of cultivating compassion for all people, is work that we do for ourselves as much as we do it for the people that we're cultivating compassion for. And I think if we look at it that way, then we can build powerful movements, because the more we do work to acknowledge the sanctity of all people, then we're also reminding ourselves that we ourselves are sacred, right? That we ourselves matter, that we will never be outside of the interwoven web of humanity. And if even someone who is causing as much harm as Donald Trump is causing, if even he is part of beloved community, then I must also be part of beloved community. And I think the importance of us grounding ourselves in that truth, that I belong, is really important, especially in these times when there's so much violence and harm and injustice and isolation. To really ground ourselves in that universal truth, I think, is really important.
Wow, that's beautiful. Well, that brings us to your great new book, Fierce Vulnerability. And it seems to me that your main point there is what we're talking about here is that the real issue behind humanity's systemic violence, injustice, and I think just global insanity, if you look at world hunger and nuclear weapons and catastrophic climate change, the real issue you're presenting is trauma, even social or global trauma, and that movement work and our goal is healing, and I interpret it as social healing or global healing. That's why you could see Dr. King as a social healer. So tell us about the book, and what are the points you're trying to make?
Yeah. One of the key things that I'm exploring with Fierce Vulnerability is the idea that injustice is not a political issue. Like, when I think about political issues, it makes me think about like partisan debates and intellectual debates and power games, and to see which side can gain more power than the other side so we can pass this new piece of legislation. But to me, injustice is less a political issue and much more a manifestation of collective trauma. Like what I've worked with so many incarcerated people and other communities who have experienced, witnessed, and perpetrated a lot of violence. And every time I slow down enough to understand that individual person's story, everything they do begins to make sense. Right? Like it doesn't condone what they do or what they did, but it begins to make sense. And so much of that is understanding how trauma impacts our ability to create healing for individuals as well as for the world, and how trauma is at the source of so much of the violence that we cause each other in our society. And so, a lot of fierce vulnerability is about learning the lessons from the last 50 years of trauma healing work and neuroscience, and really understanding why we inflict violence on each other because we've experienced violence, and how that impacts our brains and it impacts our ability to even think about things like interdependence. And taking those lessons and kind of scaling them up and infusing nonviolent movements with an understanding of how trauma works, both as individuals, but also as nation states and as a species. And really understanding, another concept that we play with in the book is that when you're working with traumatized people, you know that you can't just go to groups of traumatized people and point our fingers and say, stop. Like that's never going to be effective in helping them heal through their trauma. And I think in social movements, that's kind of how we oftentimes tend to try to create change, is to go to people who are, quote unquote, being unjust and point our fingers and say, you need to stop doing that. Like movements oftentimes kind of move with this energy of we're here to shut things down. And I think if we can understand injustice as manifestations of trauma, then can we move with an energy not of we're here to shut things down, but we're actually here to open things up. Like tactically, we may need to shut down highways and government meetings and whatever it might be, but can we move with the spirit of we're actually here to open up important conversations about why this violence is happening. We're here to open up possibilities for healing and possibilities for connection.
That's so powerful. Thank you. So where did you get this phrase, and what does it mean to you, fierce vulnerability? And you're not just talking about individually, right, but movements acting through what you're calling fierce vulnerability. And you're talking about that, I presume, through Kingian nonviolence.
Yeah, so the words fierce vulnerability, ironically, we don't remember who the first person was that said it, but I have a friend, Chris Moore-Bachman, and he was
Yes.
involved in an action years ago. Yeah, the author of The Gandhian Iceberg.
Yeah, great book.
He was involved in an action years ago in North Carolina where they were protesting the construction of the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and him and a group of his friends shut down the governor's mansion. And during the planning of that action, the words fierce vulnerability, kind of someone spoke it into the air, and then it kind of took on a life of its own. And at that action, they asked themselves the night before the action, what are the qualities that we long to see in these action spaces? And so they talked about how they want to see connection and healing and love and all of these things. And so out of that conversation, they decided during the action that they weren't going to hold any signs. They weren't going to do any chants. And it's kind of like, well, if you're at a protest and you're not holding signs and you're not chanting, what do you do? And so what they did was they took over the governor's mansion. They sat in a circle in the lobby. And then when the governor, who was out of town, sent his staff down to go talk to these protesters, instead of yelling at them, instead of giving them a list of demands, the protesters went around and each one talked very vulnerably about why they were there, and about the fears that they have about the future of their children and the climate and what the pipeline would mean for their communities, some of them coming to tears expressing why they were there. And Chris said that you could see tears welling up in the eyes of the staff of the governor, and also even some of the police officers. And so, we got that idea that, when I do trauma healing work, I know that when one person can model vulnerability, it just opens up possibilities for transformation that wasn't available before that. And so part of what we're playing with is that when we go into these demonstrations and protests and engage in nonviolent direct action, instead of leading with, here's what we demand, or instead of leading with, we are here because you're wrong, what if we led with the message of, we are scared, our hearts are breaking, our communities are being destroyed, we don't know what to do? Like, if we led with that kind of vulnerability, then could it open up possibilities that might not be present otherwise? We might still be shutting down the highway, but the message and the spirit that we are bringing to that space is different.
Wow, that's so beautiful. Um, so, are there strategies or key attitudes that you recommend that people cultivate um, if we're going to be organizing around a model of fierce vulnerability? Does that make sense in your book? And what do you mean by, in the subtitle, emerging through collapse?
Yeah, two very important questions. One is, yeah, so a lot of fierce vulnerability, not just the book, but we've been building this thing called the Fierce Vulnerability Network, and we do workshops around it. Is if we imagine ourselves modeling our own vulnerability as a way to touch into the vulnerability of other people to create transformation, what is the work that we need to do to prepare ourselves to play that kind of role? A lot of it is doing our own internal grief work so that when we're out in these actions, we can touch into that grief, but also we've processed it enough internally so we're not opening up like wide open wounds. A lot of the work that we do is encouraging our colleagues and our movement allies to do our own shadow work and our own trauma healing work so that when we're out there engaging in such a traumatizing world, it doesn't unconsciously trigger our own traumas. Because what happens when our trauma is triggered is that our ability to practice nonviolence, our ability to have empathy and curiosity and think about concepts like interdependence, the part of our brain that is capable of doing those things is cut off, right? So the more we can do our own healing, the more we can be in these escalated moments of the history of our species in a more grounded way. And so, in addition to learning how to shut down highways and form blockades, learning how to breathe deeply, learning how to meditate or pray, learning how to sing songs together, these are all things that help us prepare to model vulnerability in a fierce way. And emerging through collapse is just it's an acknowledgement of two things. One is that we are in a polycrisis, right? We are in the midst of climate catastrophe and pandemics and the erosion of the democratic process and rising fascism, and all of these things are happening around us. We are not crazy for feeling like the world is burning all around us. The world is literally burning all around us. And I think part of the work of fierce vulnerability is the vulnerability to accept that reality, as scary as it might feel, that we are on the precipice of one of the biggest transition moments in the history of our species, perhaps, and having the fierceness not to collapse under the weight of the gravity of that situation. And then, kind of playing on the concept of emergence, like emerging through this collapse, because the changes that are happening in our world are so big that we are no longer the driving forces for change. The earth is the driving force for change. And there's no way for us to map out a work plan from here to liberation, right? Like, we have to rely on emergence, which is about centering ourselves enough so that we can hear the subtle voices of emergence, of spirit, of inspiration, and just sense and respond along the way. As an activist, I've always been taught that we have to have this grand strategy that figures out every contingency to get us from here to victory. But I don't think we're at that place anymore. And so, how can we really have faith that if we slow down enough and listen to our hearts, we will be guided into the actions that we need to take?
Oh, that's lovely. I hear a lot of Buddhism in your approach to this Kingian nonviolence and your new framework of fierce vulnerability. And that's just so helpful and fresh. And it's taking us, as you write a lot about, and I want to ask you to speak even more to it, beyond us versus them, or right versus wrong. I guess it's this phrase non-duality as movement people, which would then lead to social healing. That we're all one, we're all in the same boat, that we got to get beyond judging. And that's the beauty of that story of North Carolina. I was learning that in Los Alamos, New Mexico, where we had a vigil for 20 years at the birthplace of the bomb, where every nuclear bomb is built. And we were grappling with that because Gandhi said you need a symbol. So we took up the book of Jonah, Kazu, and every year hundreds of us went through the whole town and poured ashes on the ground and sat in sackcloth. And the message was, we're not pointing fingers. We're taking responsibility. We're all in this boat together. And, of course, ashes and stuff. And we felt changed. But the whole state knew what we were saying. But it was trying to get beyond pointing fingers at the people, the millionaires and incredibly rich, powerful people who build nuclear weapons, and judging them because we need them. They're the only ones who can dismantle these darn things. That's one of the truths that I came to. So say more about, what I hear you talking about and inviting us to is experimenting in ways to get over that hump, to plumb the depths of Dr. King's teaching about the interrelated connection between all of us, all things, and Mother Earth, and that we have to, in effect, get so much more serious about nonviolence.
Yeah, definitely. So, I'll start by sharing that, as some people may know, like I'm deeply grounded in Buddhist teachings. A Japanese Buddhist order called Nipponza Myohoji was my introduction to social change work when I was 17 years old. Spent a year and a half living in their monasteries. And the first book on Buddhism I ever read was a book by Thich Nhat Hanh called Living Buddha, Living Christ,
Yeah.
who was essentially saying that, like, if you get down to the essence of the teachings of the Buddha and Jesus, I was also taught at a meditation retreat years ago that the Buddha didn't teach Buddhism. The Buddha taught universal truths that emerge in all the world's traditions. And so as a Buddhist, when I read Dr. King, I'm like, oh, Dr. King was a Buddhist because he was also always talking about interdependence and this idea that we depend on each other, that my liberation is deeply interwoven with the liberation of all people, right? And so I think that is one of the essential teachings of nonviolence is this unwavering faith in interdependence. And one of the teachings that does come from the Buddhist tradition that is really helpful is the doctrine of two truths that teaches us that in our world, we're always living in two different levels of reality. One is what's called the relative level, which is the much more linear level. It's the things that we can see and touch and feel with our hands. But there's also this ultimate reality, which is much more mystical and magical. And both realities exist at the same time. And so in the relative reality, there is a left and a right and an up and a down. But in space, there's no such thing as left or right or up and down. And both things are true. And so I think, in the relative reality, Donald Trump has power. And he is causing a lot of harm, and that needs to stop. But in the ultimate reality, which is also true, if people like Donald Trump and all of the people who support him are not liberated, then we will always be at odds, and there will always be war, and there will always be division. And so how can we continue to move in a way that acknowledges that, yeah, some people have power that they're wielding in abusive ways, but we actually need to free them from the delusion of their own sense of superiority and supremacy in order for all of us to heal.
That's so beautiful. So the power of active nonviolent love. I'm thinking of Philip Berrigan, who used to say, he was a longtime activist and a friend of mine, and he used to say towards the people at the Pentagon where we would go and vigil, we pray for them and we resist them. And no, that was his language from there, that talking about love, that we're really praying for folks, for their change of heart. Romero was huge about that. He was always talking positively about the junta and the death squad people. It's amazing to me if you really study him and saying, we're praying for you and you need to be converted. We call you to
That's
put the
right.
guns down. And that's what Phil was saying. And I don't know that we do that enough here, that we are publicly loving and praying for conversion and disarmament and transformation among all people, including ourselves, you're saying. And then that takes a public form of resistance.
That's right.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And, Dr. King, there's a famous story from the civil rights era where they were protesting in Selma, Alabama. And the sheriff in Selma at the time, who was one of the more violent sheriffs in the South that they had to face, there was a time when he got sick with the flu or something, I'm not sure. And one of the lead organizers at the time, James Bevel, took all of the movement activists and they held a prayer vigil outside of his house, praying for his wellness, and doing things like that, like, yes, we are going to resist you in every way we can. And we heard you're sick and we hope you're feeling better because you are still our brother. You are still a member of this beloved community. I think that sort of non-dual truth, again, is really important for us to hold.
That's beautiful. Tell me about your work in prisons. What have you been doing there? Teaching
Oh, a lot of
nonviolence?
things.
Yeah. Are you still
Teaching
doing that?
nonviolence and being taught nonviolence.
Ah,
So
right.
these
Yeah.
people, incarcerated people, are some of the most dedicated peace activists I have ever met in my entire life, because they know violence. They understand the dynamic of violence. They know where violence has brought them. And they know, so many of them come from very violent neighborhoods, and they know what their communities need more than anything else. And, I always say that I didn't know what words like accountability meant until I met these incarcerated people who have been doing so much incredible healing and incredible work, trying to hold themselves accountable and trying to be an agent of change, and to try to create more of a culture of peace, both in their own hearts, in the prisons, reaching out to communities that they have harmed. So I consider the incarcerated people that I work with to be some of my greatest teachers.
That's wonderful. Well, we're about out of time. I wonder where can people get in touch with you or get your new book, Fierce Vulnerability?
Yeah, so folks can find out about my work on my website, kazuhaga.com. It's Kazuhaga. And you can buy the book there. It's linked to my publisher, Parallax Press, which is a nonprofit Buddhist publisher founded by Thich Nhat Hanh. So definitely encourage people to buy straight from them as opposed to some of the other large online retailers that I will not name.
Before we end, is there any last thing that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Yeah, there's a lot of crises happening in our world today, particularly around climate. It's probably the biggest existential threat that we have faced as a species. And I continue to think that as the Earth is going through these massive transformations, that it's also opening up huge opportunities for us to make transformative change, right? Every time there's a crisis, there's a huge opportunity. And so to look at the Earth as our ally, the Earth is giving us so many opportunities to create transformative change at a level that may not have been unimaginable before. And so, there's a lot of opportunities for us coming up to widen the window of what we think is politically feasible. So, listen to the Earth and be with the Earth, and to take advantage of everything that it's offering us.
Well, thank you so much, Kazu Haga, for speaking with me today. It's been a blessing. And thank you, friends, for listening to the Nonviolent Jesus podcast. You can hear more podcasts and find other upcoming Zoom programs at beatitudecenter.org. And please consider offering a donation to support this free work. And if you can, please leave some positive feedback or a review at NCR or Apple or Spotify or whatever platform you use. So may the God of peace bless everyone, and keep on following the Nonviolent Jesus, and see you next time. Thanks so much, everyone.